Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boxes. This is a podcast episode, which means that you can listen wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch the full episode right here on YouTube. Today, I am very excited because we are doing something a little different and I'm the one being interviewed rather than interviewing. And the person interviewing today is my very own brother. So welcome, brother of mine.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invite.
Ooh,
I'm very happy.
I recognize that background.
Yes, as I wanted to say, I am actually in Jaï's studio, which is quite funny as Jaï is on the other side of the earth. And I'm very happy and excited to have this podcast with you. So let's dive straight in it and ask you the question which you generally ask your interviewees. Which labels, if any, do you identify with?
Okay, so the labels I identify with have changed a lot over time. When I first started Beyond Boxes, it was a YouTube channel, and I talked then about a bunch of different labels I was identifying with at the time and gave definitions of those. But now, which labels, if any, do I identify with? I guess I identify with being multi-ethnic, with being a person of color. I identify with being queer, with being pansexual. I sometimes use bisexual as an umbrella term, and I talk about that again in some of my videos. I sometimes identify as a woman and sometimes identify as more gender fluid. I've been going through a bit of a gender identity crisis recently. How do I identify? I think there's so many other ways I can talk about. I also identify as being disabled. That's been a big one for me. I identify as a podcast host. I identify in a lot of different ways, but those labels can change over time, and I use different ones depending on context and who I'm speaking to a lot of the time as well.
Okay, thank you. And I've got a question about that. For me, it was before I've learned a lot from talking to you on all these various topics. And for me, at first, it felt quite overwhelming. All these labels were just like, why can't we just be all humans?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, how can labels and kind of having some kind of boxes help with one's identifying with oneself?
I think that's a really good question. And it's kind of a question I've been exploring throughout all these episodes and that I continue exploring in my own life. And a lot of the time, my guests will come onto this podcast. And when the first question I ask them is which labels they identify with, if any, they're like, oh, we're going beyond boxes. Why are we talking about labels? So I think it's a really interesting question. But so there's a lot of different reasons. And one of the reasons is around community. So by choosing to identify with certain labels, I feel like I've been able to connect with people who have shared experiences to me. So Dr. Sophia Graham and I, who's one of my guests, we talk about mirrors and windows, how it's important to have mirrors of your own experience reflected back on you and windows into the lives and experiences of other people. And that's one of the reasons I created this podcast, actually, because I choose to amplify the voices of people where we don't actually get that many windows into their lives and their experiences. So this whole podcast is a series of windows into the experiences of other people. And to be able to connect with people who might mirror our own experience back, we need to sometimes labels can be really helpful to create that connection, to create that sense of like community or that sense of belonging. And that's not to say that everyone who identifies with the same label will have the same experiences, but it creates, like, if I say the label queer and someone else identifies as queer as well, then we know that there's something that connects us. We know that there's something we have in common. If I use the label bisexual, which again, I don't actually identify as bisexual, I don't really think of myself as bisexual, but it's a label I use because it's one word to describe a whole bunch of experiences and things without having to get into it. So Mel Cassidy and I as well talked about descriptive labels rather than prescriptive labels. So sometimes it is easier when people, you know, like I might mention a girlfriend or something, and people are like, oh, so you're gay? And I'm like, oh no, I'm bi, or something like that, you know, and it's easier sometimes. So it's about ease, it's about connection. And it's also taking into account the reality of the world we live in. Well, of course, it's a utopic idea that we can all just be human and just be who we are and express ourselves the way we are and have the experiences we have with no discrimination, with no judgment, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world where people are categorized. We live in a world where certain groups of people are considered superior or inferior based on categorization. So we already live in a world where people are putting labels on us, whether we choose to identify with them or not. And so it's part of it is also reclaiming the power of labels, saying this is how I identify, this is the label I'm using for myself. And like queer, that was originally used as an insult for groups of people, you know, especially the gay community, the LGBTQIA+ community, which was a shorter acronym back in the days where queer was used as an insult. And it's been reclaimed by the community. It's taking the power back. Language is so important, and language holds so much power. And so labels are a use of language, where we can reclaim that. And again, I'm not saying that labels are also a very personal thing, and they're a very fluid thing. The labels I identify with, as I said at the beginning, have changed over time. And I know lots of friends who use different labels, and I've gone through phases where I choose not to use labels. So like with my gender at the moment, I'm not really choosing a label. And then the labels I do choose changes a lot. So sometimes I say like, I'm a gender fluid woman, which I know what that means to me, and I can get into a whole description explaining why. But that's also something I like about labels, is that it opens a conversation. For me, that's why I talk about going beyond boxes. For me, it's not about having a label to put someone in a box or to put myself in a box. It's about initiating a conversation. So when I use the labels at the beginning, you can like ask me about those, for example, if you're unfamiliar or whatever, or other people, and it creates curiosity as well, I believe.
Completely, and that really resonates with me. As we've discussed, I'm reading Ruth Sking's book at the moment, and I was just realizing how all my friends around me are basically white, and I've grown in this, you know, white world, and people put labels on me that aren't white, and I could consider myself white until a certain age where I looked and realized that people were seeing me as a different person than white. And I've been discussing this with my friends, and I really realized that I needed to have this conversation with them, for them seeing me as not white. We've never talked about this then. They just see me as how they are. That's what they would say to me. But I feel like they need to ask me these questions and see that I'm not white, in order to not deny everything that I go through, because I live a different experience that they do.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly it. So it's not saying, so how do you identify these days in terms of like your racial and ethnic identity?
That's a tough question. First time I guess I'm putting labels, but I would consider myself multi-ethnical. It depends on context, because sometimes when I grow up, I was considered black, so I can identify myself as black, but also I know in various other contexts, I can be completely white, so I can identify myself nearly white. Much less, I would say, just because of my darker skin, I would say, and also my hair has also an impact in that.
And I think that's one of the things about us being mixed, is that it is harder to choose a label, is that we don't fit in a box. We're not black, and we're not white, and we're not Asian. We have a combination of all those ethnicities, and we are still whole humans. We're not like just, you know, sometimes I joke and I say, I'm not black, I'm not white. It's not a joke. I say, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm Asian, but I am all three. Like they're, you know, and so that's why I use the word multi-ethnic and the label multi-ethnic, and it sounds like that resonates for you as well, which makes sense considering we share the same DNA and the same ethnic mix. But like you say, if you don't use any language, if you're just like, but then you're not white and your friends are white, and until you start naming those things, you can't have those discussions about the fact that you are treated differently in society and have different experiences to other people in society.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll go on to the next question, which is, Why did you start Beyond Boxes, the YouTube channel, now the podcast, and yeah, why did you choose to create this?
So it's a good question, and there's a few different answers there, but one of the reasons is, like you said to me at the beginning, you said sometimes you hear all these labels and you feel overwhelmed, and that by talking to me you now have learned a lot and you have more clarity around what they all mean, some of why they're important, that kind of thing. And so originally that's why I kind of started originally it was just a YouTube channel where I was sort of defining different labels and identities, giving some of my own experiences and talking about why they are and aren't important, and exploring the pros and cons of them. And then one of the reasons I felt qualified to do that is because of my own experiences of always being in between. So you and I have just touched a bit upon like the in-betweenness of our ethnic and racial identities, where our, you know, very mixed, mixedness. But for me as well, you know, I have that with my sexuality, being pansexual, not feeling, I'm definitely not gay or straight, and I don't even really feel bisexual. So it's very similar to me, where I'm like, none of these boxes quite fit. And so I use pansexual and that fits better. But again, half the people don't even know what that means. It just means I'm attracted to certain people and not to others. And the gender isn't a factor in the same way that like their eye color or their ethnicity isn't a factor. And it's not to say that I don't understand or recognize when I'm with someone of different genders. It's just that that's not what impacts whether I'm attracted to someone or not. And so, then, sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious, how was it for you then growing up and maybe having these ideas, these questions, but not really being able to have many answers in our world?
I remember as a teenager, like I remember at school, someone suspected that there was a woman who was gay. And that like again, because I've always been very fluid in my identity, I've always had very different friendship groups. So when I was at school, I was really close friends with like the skater dudes and the stoners, right? If we're just stereotyping high school groups. I was really good friends with the bitchy girls. I was really good friends with the sort of nerdy brainiacs. I had all these different friendship groups. And it was really hard. I always have been a social chameleon. So I felt natural going between the different groups, but I noticed how much I changed myself and changed my identity with each group to be liked. And it took a long time for me to feel like I could fully be myself and express myself for who I am. And maybe we can get into that later. But the point is, so remember that I was like, yeah, and my friends never really understood how I could be friends with everyone else, because when I was with them, they felt like, you're one of us, why are you friends with them? But I never felt like I fit in quite with any friendship group. I felt like I could be a social chameleon and get on with everyone, but never really fit into one group. And I still feel like that today. I travel so much, and each place I go to, I feel like I can blend in more than other people, but I don't quite fit or belong to those groups. And so I was hanging out with I think it was the bitchy girl crowd, and they were like talking about this woman that they suspected was gay, and you know, like making comments about her. And I was like, why do you care? I was like, why does it impact you? Because even then there was something about it that really riled me up. And I said, what if I'm bi? Like, I said, what if I'm gay? Or what if I'm bi? I think I said bi at the time because people knew I fancied boys as well. And I can't remember the friend's reaction. I say friend, more of an acquaintance, friend at the time, exactly. But I think she was sort of taken aback and was like, yeah, but like that's different because you know. And I remember it's actually the same person who later on in life, when I'd left home and I'd gone to uni and I was like awakening to my own experiences of my racial and sexual identity and how I was different and how I was treated different and all that kind of thing. And I remember I came back home for Christmas one year, and I went out clubbing with some of my old friends, and ended up kissing a guy in a club who happened to be Black. And then this same friend like made a comment like, oh, so you get with Black guys now? And I was like aghast, because I was like, you've met me, you've met my family, you've met my mother, you've met my brother, like I am. And she, again, that same kind of, oh, but with you it's different. So, you know, those kind of experiences, I think, taught me already that like how people categorize other people, how people treat other people as inferior, or think it's okay to tease people, or not even tease, but like reject people or make people feel inferior or take the piss out of people for being different. And I've always been different, and yet I always felt like I had privilege because I could sort of fit in. And again, that's kind of how I came to create Beyond Boxes, feeling like I see it from all the different angles a lot of the time. So I have a lot of systemic privilege, and I'm also have a lot of systemic oppression and marginalization. And so again, that kind of in-betweenness feeling. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, it does answer my question. It comes to the next question I was going to ask you, just if you could talk about the evolution around these topics of your personal experience and your personal reflections. So you've talked a bit about it already.
So yeah, so obviously you and I had a very unusual upbringing, and for me even more so because I'm older than you, for those who might not be able to tell by looking at us, because I have the baby face. But so I was born in India and then spent a few years traveling with mum and dad, where like through Europe, so in all different countries, and then finally settled in France, which is where you were born, and grew up there. But we grew up like obviously with hippie parents and who were very like spiritual and into meditation, and we, you know, growing up in a center where people would come from all around the world, so we were in contact with lots of cultures, and then again traveling lots. So having this unusual upbringing, regardless of like race and sexuality and gender and all of that for a moment, just having this unusual upbringing meant that I always felt different. I was always the odd one out. And yet, like I said, so through that, I developed the skill to adapt, to become a social chameleon, as it were, to connect with people. I'm someone, I love connecting with people. I love talking to people. I love finding out people's stories, people of all different identities. But like growing up, it was even just from different cultures. You know, we were really lucky that we traveled so much as kids. And I went and spent like lots of time in India when I was a kid. My mom and dad just took us out of school. I think you weren't at school yet, but I was. And so it took me out of school for a few months. And then, you know, I tried to go to school in India for a bit. And like, but like, so I learned from very early on to adapt and to accept people from all different environments and to understand the subtleties of difference. And so that in itself. And then becoming aware again of my racial identity, which I know you're going through a little bit of that journey at the moment, like you were talking about. And then, you know, for me, a lot of that was when I left home and I went traveling, and the way that suddenly I was treated, because growing up in small rural environments, yes, I had my friend who was like homophobic and racist, who I've mentioned, but who treated me as still like, who accepted me. Like that was the thing. She was like, oh, you're different, you're one of us, right? And everyone was always like, you're one of us. So I was sort of accepted, even though I was also never quite felt like I fit in. And then going into the society, going to university, learning about feminism and racial dynamics, becoming more aware of my sexual orientation, which I'd always sort of been aware of, but never really got the chance to explore, noticing how much I'd internalized messages of inferiority. So it was super hard for me to come out as bisexual or pansexual or whatever, because I'd internalized messages of what that looked like. And this is an area where I think labels can be quite dangerous, is when people assign a box to a label and think that like this label means this thing and that there is no nuance to it. And as soon as people start becoming rigid with labels, that's when it becomes dangerous, and we internalize ideas. And I've internalized a lot of like, yeah, biphobia, homophobia, racism, because I grew up in a society, we all grow up in society where that is the messaging we receive. And so that's, for example, how I came about to create the Power, Privilege and Prejudice workshops that I lead. And that's one of the things that I teach in that, which you came to my very first one a couple of years ago. And so yeah, so it's like how noticing that there were all those messages, and then noticing how my own, because I had all these messages towards myself, right? But then I started becoming more comfortable with my sexuality, more comfortable with my racial identity, finding more people who reflected my experiences, finding, you know, becoming part of the queer community, then I moved to London and was part of the like super sex positive feminists, non-monogamous queer scene, as it were, and it was like, these are my people, but most people were still super white. And then I became friends with other people of color, of different ethnicities, and there was like something that connected us as well. Then I had friends who were trans and non-binary, and I learned about that, because even though before I sort of heard of it vaguely and was sort of like slightly open, I thought I was open-minded, it's not until I actually met people who were trans and or non-binary and got to know them and hear them share their experiences that I could connect and be like, oh, it's important. This is important. This is something I didn't know about. And because I have privilege in this area, this is something where I can amplify their voices and support that. And same, sex work was another thing where I thought I was super open-minded. And then I got called out by someone at an event who was a sex worker, and realized that I had a lot of internalized prejudice. And again, that I was doing, and I talk about this in one of my episodes on this podcast as well, with Veronica Monet, who's a former sex worker, who honored me with a conversation about her career and about sex work in general. And we talk about going beyond shame and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, so we're all noticing how we're all, regardless of whether we think we belong to the norm or we don't, regardless of whether we feel different for like systemic reasons or internalized reasons or both, personal, that's something else I teach in my workshops, is the difference between like personal and systemic sort of marginalization or difference. And we're all socialized and we all receive the same messages from society, and those messages can be enhanced or changed depending on our family of origin, depending on our culture, depending where we grow up, with who our friends were, all this kind of stuff. But we do internalize that. And so once I realized that, and because I'd had the honor of connecting with people from so many different experiences, and because I myself had, and then I was involved in other projects, which was all about amplifying voices of marginalized people. And I learned a lot doing that. But I felt like I wanted to connect people and to create a sort of bridge between different communities. And and that's kind of how it came about, I guess.
Incredible evolution.
And there's one thing that I haven't mentioned, which as well, which was, so I have a lot of health problems, which again, I've mentioned and speak about a bit with Sophia Graham when we talk about going beyond disability. And, I spent large chunks of my life totally bedbound. And those times have also given me a lot of time to think. And so, after I'd moved to London and I was part of this community and I was thinking a lot, I've been thinking about identity my whole life and trying to figure out my own identity. But then I was bedbound. I got glandular fever and was bedbound for 15 months and using a wheelchair. And I had to give up my whole career, which was going super well. I used to work in TV production. I used to have a really great career. I was on track to do great things. And then all that felt like it was ripped away from me. And so I started thinking about all the skills that I'd picked up and all the life experiences I had. And they all kind of culminated. I was like, what can I do with all this information and these beliefs? And basically what I do in my work and in my life today is I just try and live my values. I don't think of this as a career anymore. I think, and so that's also part of why I do this work and how this work came about.
Interesting. I still discover things, even though we're brothers and sisters, every time we talk. So it's always very fascinating and interesting for me. And I guess, you have a certain experience. You're quite far from the white cisgendered man who's healthy. So I can imagine you have that experience to share and create this connection. And I just want to ask you a bit more about these workshops, which I attended, PPP, Pride, Privilege, and Prejudice, which I did the first one, and it was a very, it was quite powerful for many people. My friends were attending. And my question is, how did you come to kind of realizing that workshop and seeing how it can, benefit all type of people, wherever they come from?
Well, yes, it can benefit everyone because, as I said, we all receive the same messages. So whether we're in a place of privilege or not, or we're in a place of being marginalized and oppressed, like in a group that gets marginalized and oppressed by society, by others, by the dominant groups, or whether we're in the dominant group, we're all internalizing the same messages. So we all need to do the work to become aware of those internalized messages, because it will impact us differently. So if you're in the dominant group, i.e. a straight, cis, able-bodied man, for example, then it will impact the way you treat other people. You know, you might consider other groups as inferior. But even for people, but then if you're part of groups that are more marginalized and oppressed, you'll internalize those messages and you'll think you're inferior. But then for people like me who are sort of in between groups, there's both, right? So like I was talking about my realizations around sex workers, for example, and how for a long time I othered that group of people and I guess thought of them as somehow inferior. Whereas, you know, rather than just, and then it's not until I became really good friends with someone who was a sex worker and even considered sex work myself, that I realized, oh, it's just a profession, we're all humans. And same, just yesterday, I was talking to one of my really good friends about homelessness and homeless people. And again, that's another area where I think a lot of us can, have these biases and this thing of like, it's not conscious. It's not like, if I have a conversation, I'm not going to say, oh, I think I'm better than a homeless person. Like no one would say that in the same way white people don't say out loud, I think I'm better than a black person. And, you know, men don't say, oh, I think I'm better than women. But there is those messages that get transmitted and we act, if we're not conscious of them, we act them out. We play them out in our lives. In companies, people will like hire the straight cis white man over the, you know, black woman, for example, because not consciously, but because unconsciously they're playing out the messages they've been receiving in society, which is why it's so important that we understand where those messages come from. And then I obviously have done a lot of like meditation and sensing practices in my life. I've done a lot of work on myself, lots of personal development work. I've also attended lots of nonviolent communication workshops. And it was actually during a nonviolent communication workshop, they were doing half a day on power and privilege. And then the conversation that ensued, I realized how much it went over people's heads, how much people touch upon these topics in a very cognitive way, in a very like, let's debate this, and whether you're pro or like for or against certain notions, the moment that we forget that we're talking about human beings, that we are all human and we are all deserving of the same treatment, the same respect, that we all exist and we all have values as individuals and as communities and as groups, then it becomes problematic. So if people start talking about being, you know, one of the examples I sometimes use is around refugees, which is very, you know, topical at the moment, because we see with the war in Ukraine how people treat white refugees very differently to the way they treat black and brown refugees, right? But whether you're for or against, like if you start talking about them and disempower people, disempower whole groups of people and make generalizations and forget that you're talking about human beings with families, with friends, with history. And so again, it's really about, finding the humanity in us all and not creating a hierarchy of superior or inferior in terms of individual or groups.
And creating conversation, I guess, also just around
creating
yourself.
connection, and that's not to say that, you know, because sometimes people take away from my workshop, oh, we're all human, we're all one, let's all, like, we don't need to worry about all this labels and identity, we don't need to worry about differentiation, we're all one, everything's great. Yes, and and that's, you know, that's what sometimes gets referred to as spiritual bypassing, because yes, we're all human and we're all deserving the same respect, but we're not all treated equally. We're treated very differently by this society, and that's not an accident either. Like, systems have been put in place to treat certain groups of people as inferior and certain groups as superior, to enable the capitalistic and white supremacist patriarchal society we live in. And those are words that scare people, and people are going to be put off hearing this and be like, oh, there she goes again, like crazy, you know, queer brown woman ranting about all this stuff. But no, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to recognize the reality that we live in and start from here to create connection, rather than starting from a utopic idea. So it comes round to, again, when you asked me about the importance of labels at the beginning, it's the same kind of thing, right? Like, yes, we are all human beings and we should just be able to express ourselves, but we always need to take into account the reality of the world and the society we live in and start from there. Because if we start from utopia, we're not actually going to work. We're not actually going to be able to do the work.
Start from the base.
Start from reality. Start from where we are. Start from right here, right now. And so that's also a spiritual concept, right? So when people are like, we're one, it's like, yes, but come back to the present moment. Look around you, understand your reality and your surroundings, and then let's talk.
Happens, yeah, I can see that happening quite a lot. Also, I'm talking from my perspective, so I would say most of my entourage, so that's a French word.
Your entourage. You can say that in English as well.
Sorry, had to give the little accent. They're younger, and also it's newer subjects, newer topics to them. And I can see them sometimes, tiptoeing around these subjects, because they're sensitive and they want to know more, but they're also afraid to do a wrong step. So what advice what could you give them to kind of be more at ease and just, create these conversations which are necessary?
I think that's a really great question. And I'm actually surprised because from my experience, a lot of the younger generation are already very aware of these topics and are doing the work. So it's interesting that you say that you put together that the younger and so tiptoeing. But I think partly it's also, I think France, let's be honest, we grew up in France. One of the reasons I lead my workshops on power, privilege, and prejudice mostly in France is because France has some catching up to do on these topics. And I'm sorry to anyone listening who gets offended by that, but it's true. And I get to say that as someone who was raised and lives in France usually. And so partly maybe it's also because a lot of your friendship circles are French and there is less education on these topics in France. And most of the education that does happen on these topics on social media and stuff are in English. So unless they're fully bilingual and following lots of English creators and stuff, then it is harder. And so as for advice, I think, however, the tiptoeing around it, the being afraid to make mistakes, that is super common. And I think that goes across all generations. And that's, again, one of the reasons I originally created Beyond Boxes, which was originally just defining topics and allowing people to come in with unknowns and questions and just normalizing it. Because when I started on this journey, I knew nothing, and I learned it because I had the fortunate experiences of encountering people from lots of different, and partly it's because I live my life with an open mind and I like connecting to people and I listen to people, and I've done nonviolent communication work, which means I've learned to actively listen to people. But yeah, so as for advice, I think there's a few different things. There's number one is be open-minded. Be open-minded, and open-minded means open-minded towards other people's experiences and knowing that you can't always relate to someone else's experience. You don't always know what's going on for someone else, right? That you can't. You just, like your friends suddenly being like, oh, but we don't think of you as black or brown. We just think of you as like our friend. And it's like, yes, but you have different experiences because you're brown. And the fact that you're having those conversations with them and that they're opening up to that and that they're understanding that is really great to hear. So be open-minded. Be open-minded about your own experiences. Be open-minded that things and your own thoughts, that actually we don't like to admit that we're all a bit brainwashed, but we are all a bit brainwashed. We are all receiving constant messages from media, from family, and those messages are constantly being reinforced. So open-minded, question things, question your own thoughts and beliefs. Be curious. It's good to be curious, and curious means asking questions. It means doing your own research. It means typing things into Google when you hear new words that you don't know what they mean. It's, you know, and it's, yeah, and it's good to be curious. I really encourage curiosity. And then also boundaries, like both setting and receiving boundaries. So it's good to ask questions and be curious, but sometimes it might be exhausting for someone to receive all these questions. It's hard when you're someone who belongs to an oppressed and marginalized group to constantly be an educator when you're talking about your lived experiences and people are talking about hypotheticals and they respond, and people can have very dismissive or defensive reactions. So again, it's important, this is why it's important to be open-minded, to be curious, and to question yourself. And if you feel uncomfortable, that is a good sign. That's a sign that you can grow and evolve from discomfort. That's a sign that something is being looked at, something is coming to the surface, there's some belief, some tension is coming up. And so get excited by discomfort, learn to sit with it, learn to be curious about it. And again, one of the things I teach in my workshops is the difference between an uncomfortable and unsafe. So if you're from a dominant group talking about a topic, it might be uncomfortable. If you're white and you're talking about race with someone who is not white, then you might feel uncomfortable. But if you're black or brown and you're talking about race with a white person, you might start to feel unsafe because you have grown up in a society receiving messages that are traumatic, and you've dealt with a lot of trauma through racism, and having someone deny your experiences or question your experiences or be dismissive or defensive about your experiences it's not just uncomfortable, it can re-trigger real trauma. So it's really important both to set and receive boundaries. And so that's one example around race, but that's true of other things. So for example, around gender, if you and me were to have a conversation around gender experiences, you being a man and me being a mostly woman, you know, there are moments where you might get uncomfortable. If I remember you and I hope you're okay with me including this, but I remember that something happened with a cousin of ours, and you know, and I made some comments to you about the way you were, and you got like upset by it, which is understandable. And so again, it's like when you understand you're having a conversation about a dominant group, and you belong to when you're having a conversation about a topic and you belong to the dominant group, so if you're talking about race and you're white, if you're talking about gender and you're a man, or you're cisgendered and you're talking about trans rights or non-binary rights, for example, if you're talking about all these topics, then it's important to sit with your discomfort, allow it. But if you're feeling unsafe, it's okay to say stop. And if someone says, I'm sorry, I really don't feel comfortable talking about this right now, you don't insist. You don't say, no, I want to know, you need to educate me. You don't perpetuate the same entitlement that is already exists, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I feel like
it makes complete sense. And you said exactly. I remember this time we were in New Zealand, and I remember I was very uncomfortable and bit frustrated and a bit annoyed, and it took me a while really to understand what was happening, what was going on, and it was a really great learning lesson for me, at least. And you know, just realizing, oh, okay, now I speak from a dominant group, and I had no quite idea of really what was actually going on. And then it really allowed me to kind of change my perspective and just realize, you know, the reality that I had to listen. I just needed to listen and take things in, and it was hard for me. And I was a bit frustrated also that it was hard for me, because I consider myself, you know, as someone that's generally pretty open and receptive. So that was even more, you know, a bit frustrating for me, but it was a great learning curve. So I appreciate also that when you know, talk to me about
things. And I appreciate you bringing that in, because that's it. I think you've summed it up perfectly, and you've given a perfect example off the normal reactions that come up, but how this is why I say feeling uncomfortable is a good thing. I was having a conversation the other day with someone who was interviewing me, and we were talking about couple privilege, and they got uncomfortable, but they admitted, they said, I feel uncomfortable and I'm excited by that, because I know that that means that there's a structure in me, there's a belief in me that's being questioned, there's buttons that are being pushed, and that it's the opportunity to learn and evolve and grow. And like you say, if you can just listen to people and hear what they're saying, and of course the way things are said are important as well, right? So, you know, I hope to think that I was quite skillful in the way I spoke to you about what happened, but of course it was also hard for me to be very skillful, because it triggered stuff in me, right? Because I've had my own experiences of men not always respecting my boundaries. And so I can't remember exactly the tone I used. But then, and this is another reason why things like being an ally is really helpful, because we had the conversation, not just you and me, but you, me, mum, and dad. And dad was actually came in and spoke to you in a way that was probably easier for you to hear when I was feeling too charged.
Yeah, very interesting. Also, you know, family dynamics, things come in. So there was that, and also, yeah, I remember Dad's intervention helped basically for me also to understand. And I think it's, you know, as you said, the position of ally. And since we're talking about allies, how about if you could express how you are an ally to marginalized groups or oppressed groups, and even also how can we be an ally in general?
So, yeah, I think there's lots of different ways that we can be allies. As for me, one of the things I try and do is amplify voices. So part of the way I do that is through this podcast. There's a lot of talk about the word ally and whether it's the right word to use, and I could get into that, but I don't think we have time to get into that too much today. I've also heard the word accomplice, which I really like as well as an alternative to ally. And so, yeah, ways I am is trying to amplify other people's voices, but also noticing when it's an area where I have privilege. So if we're talking about sex worker rights, or if we're talking about trans rights, or if we're talking about, you know, colorism, recognizing when I have privilege, and so help like supporting those who don't. So if there's a conversation going on, just either stepping in or offering support to someone. And I think we forget that there's lots of, sometimes it feels overwhelming being an ally, but so I'm going to just give an anecdote. So I was having a dinner party, and it was me, my housemate who's white, one of my really good friends who was white, and my two partners at the time who are also white. So, and then the conversations went on to race, and one of my friends was saying things that were really triggering for me and were really upsetting. And at first it just started like a nice conversation, and then it was bringing stuff up, and I was trying to explain, and they were like debating it as if we were just debating any normal topic. But for me, it was like bringing up a lot of stuff for me, because talking about race isn't like just talking about the weather or debating whether you prefer tea or coffee, right? It's really personal, and it brings up my history, and it brings up the way I'm treated, and it brings up not just my personal history, but ancestral history. It brings up societal stuff. It's like, and the other people in my room, my housemate and my partners at the time, could sense what was going on. So my housemate took over the conversation and continued discussing with my friend who wanted to keep debating, but took off the pressure from me. And my partners at the time just started like giving me a cuddle and made me a cup of tea. And so there's two really great opportunities and very different ways to be an ally. One was taking over the conversation, was doing something active, was like to give me a break. And the other was just resourcing me in that moment, because my partners could see that there'd been a lot of charge. And when there's stuff comes up, just having someone be like, what do you need? How can I support you? Here's a nice comforting cup of tea. Here's a hug. We're here for you. We love you. We understand that this was a difficult conversation for you. So I think I really like that story, because I think it shows that you don't always, if you're uncomfortable in being active, you can do other things. And so a few other examples is like, other times it's just giving someone a look. Like when someone's, going on like debating, I've definitely been like at family dinner parties where someone said something and then someone's just given me a look and rolled their eyes, and I just feel immediately like, oh, I'm not alone. I'm no longer alone, and I don't have to manage this on my own. Other times it's like when dad came in and said something to you, because of course there's family dynamics, but there's also him being a man and stuff, and it was easier for you to hear it. There was a time where you, me, and some of your friends were all having lunch together, and there was a woman, one of your friends who's female, was talking about a dynamic that was really upsetting for her in your guys' group dynamics, and one of your male friends was getting really defensive about it and wasn't listening to anything she was saying. And then you came in and you said basically everything she'd been saying, but you said it A, in a much calmer way because you weren't triggered, and B, because you're a guy, suddenly your friend listened more. And so A, it's highlighting the dynamics, the fact that he was listening to you partly because you're a man and he trusts you more. So it's showing the dynamics that guys do listen to guys more, especially when it comes to feminism. But also it was easier for you to come in because you were calmer, because you didn't have the charge. So then it also makes it easier for him to listen to you because you were calmer and didn't have the charge. So it's all so intricate, and it all shows why it's important to do the work of being an ally or an accomplice. And I'm wondering if because you as someone who has, you've stepped in and been an ally quite a few times, I think, and if you have anything that you'd like to add on the topic.
So it just reminds me of a Ruth King book, Mindful of Race, wonderful book. And she just explains, how she talks about, POCs, people of color, how just explaining, and as soon as there's racial dynamics, just, it's tiring to do the work, to explain each time. It always feels like a battle. And like you said, it can also create tension in oneself. It brings things up. And she was also expressing how, allies is just to help that person, to be able for that person to feel not alone, basically, and to be able to support that person. And as we've seen, it's easier if the person isn't necessarily in that social group we're talking about. And I've really tried as much as I can to be an ally, and I would say especially to women, just because I'm a man. So makes more sense. And the ways I do it, it depends on the context. Always the context is different. Like you said, it can be by look, and also trying to step in, but also it's delicate because I don't want to step in over the voice of the woman that's speaking at the time. So I try to kind of do some gymnastics as much as I can, depending on the context. But my awareness is always there in any time, because most of my social groups are generally around with men, white men, and a few women. That's generally what happens. So also just to, when, not to cut off when a woman talks, or also to, just to actually, look at them. And if my friend cuts her, to actually continue actually having a conversation with them. And I could notice myself before, I would generally just out of habit, just kind of turn myself towards the man speaking. So
that's so interesting. And there's a few things in what you've said which like really resonate. And I think, one of the things is you say, how a lot of your friendship group is male. And so part of being an ally and an accomplice is not just doing it performatively. So it's like, if you hear your like male friends talking down about women, for example, is standing up for women, even if there's no women in the group in that moment, right? And then another thing, what you were saying about, I think it's really important to not like speak over people who are, expressing themselves, but to amplify, to support them, to make them feel not alone. And so ways you can do that is highlight it. So if like someone cuts off a female speaker, for example, you can be like, I think she was saying something like I don't, or you can just turn to the person and be like, did you finish or did he interrupt you? Or things like that. And it's not being aggressive, it's not starting a fight, it's also just highlighting the dynamics that happen so often. And so another thing I love to do is ask questions, a lot of the time. And so that it's not like it's not saying this is the way it is, but it's just like, oh, why do you feel that? Like sometimes people make racist jokes and it's like, oh, like why do you feel that's funny, or why do you feel that's okay? And it's not like attacking, it's not taking the piss, it's not like starting a fight, or just, you know, and I'm just, these are spitballing some examples, but yeah, I think there's lots of
they resonate too, and it's just things that are good to take into account. Sometimes you kind of do spontaneously and it's just a good mixture. But I definitely feel like an ally is so powerful in these kind of dynamics.
Absolutely. And one of the things also we can do is just ask someone who's going through it, like, how can I best support you? Ask them like either during an incident, or ask them afterwards, or ask them before, like have conversations with your friends and be like, you know, you can have if you notice that, like, yeah, have conversations with your friends about, how do you feel in the group? Do you feel like you belong? How can I best support you? Or speak to your white friends, for example, and be like, you know, this is how I would like to be supported, or, you know, whatever it is, just like have conversations, keep things open.
It's interesting because talking like this seems so easy. Oh, I'll just have a conversation with them. But then it's like a language that is never used, that seems like, oh, I've never really heard that in these kind of groups. Even they're all open and everything, but you know, can just say there's still a lot of work, even though work is being done.
Yeah, and I think it's good to both look at how much work still needs to be done and acknowledge how far along we have come, how much progress we've done. Because sometimes people ask me, what's the point? Like, we live in these fucked up society, what's the point? And the point is, like, look how far we've come. Like, just not that long ago, women had no rights at all, and Black people were enslaved, you know, for example. And so it's like, we've made so much progress, and I believe we can keep making progress, and we can keep evolving as a society and as communities and as humans. And that's why I keep doing this work.
As you ask each of your interviewees at the end of the podcast, how do you go beyond boxes?
Well, I'm not sure I was ever in any box to begin with. I gave a lot of labels that I identify with, but I don't think that those put me in box. I am not defined by those labels. I am not defined by any one thing. I am not defined by my gender or my race or my sexuality or my profession or even by this body. I think labels are really supportive use of language, and they don't define me. Nothing defines me. I am fluid in my being. I am fluid in my expressions of self. I am learning new things. I make mistakes. I get called out still and learn and educate myself. I work with this discomfort that I was talking about so that I can learn and grow. And I am an evolving human who, yeah, and I don't even know if that's a box. Sometimes I don't even feel fully human. But yeah, so how do I go beyond boxes? In my very being, in how I express myself and how I live my life and how I connect to others. And yes, I think labels don't equal boxes. So yes, I identify with many labels, and yet I go beyond all the boxes.
Beautiful. Yeah, that seems like a nice note to finish on, even though you would genuinely ask, how can we know more about you and your work? But as it's your podcast.
Well, I'll still say, so people can find out more about me and my work, about my workshops, at jaïbristow.com. I also host a bunch of online events, which are often like free and online for certain amounts of time, and then they get repeated, or people can purchase lifetime access to them. I've done the Trauma Super Conference, the Relationship Super Conference. I'm working on the Anxiety Super Conference. And so people can also find links to those on my website. If people are also interested in hiring me as a diversity and inclusivity consultant, that's also something that I offer, and I really enjoy getting those because that supports a lot of what I was talking about, you know, it's a way of making money because we do still live in a capitalistic society. I hate that we do, and I wish I could do everything for free, but we don't. So again, it's taking into account the reality. So if you would like to also donate to me and support me in my work, there is my PayPal link on my website, and you can follow me on Instagram at beyond_boxes.
Perfecto. Well, it's been a true pleasure for me, at least. So thank you for inviting me here.
Me too. Thank you so much for doing this. It's really nice to be on the other side, but it's also nice to be interviewed by you and to have this chance to connect with you. And it's been really, really wonderful. So thank you, brother of mine.
A pleasure.